Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of sources and dive deep to unearth the most fascinating insights. Today, we're plunging into a story that echoes across millennia and continents, a shared memory that binds humanity. The tale of a great flood. But what if the story you thought you knew, the one of total destruction and a single righteous family, is missing some truly astonishing layers, maybe hinting at other survivors and hidden currents of history?
Indeed. We've compiled a really remarkable collection of source material for you today. Everything from foundational biblical texts like Genesis, Job, Isaiah, Psalms, to ancient Sumerian tablets, vivid Greek epic poems, intricate Egyptian hieroglyphs, the spiritual depths of Indian Vedas, the cryptic narratives of Mayan codices, and even the powerful sagas of Norse and Celtic legends.
Wow, that's quite a stack.
It really is. And our mission isn't really to prove or disprove any single account. It's more to navigate these incredibly diverse narratives, unearthing the surprising consistencies and, frankly, the provocative questions they raise.
Especially about who, or maybe what, truly survived humanity's greatest cataclysm.
Exactly. Get ready, because this is a deep dive that genuinely challenges conventional understanding and offers some, well, unexpected perspectives.
Yeah.
The enduring enigma, Nephilim and the deluge paradox.
Okay, so let's unpack a core contradiction right from the start, because it's kind of the puzzle piece that really launches our deep dive today. The biblical Genesis account seems exceptionally clear, right? God wiped out all land life, except Noah, his family, the animals on the ark.
Right. Passages like Genesis 6.1, 6.22, and 7.2324 really hammer that home. Total widespread eradication.
Yeah, it seems pretty definitive. Yet you turn a few more pages in that very same ancient text and things get, well, perplexing.
They do, because then, quite confoundingly, Genesis 6.4 tells us something really striking. The Nephilim, often translated as giants, or maybe fallen ones, were on the earth in those days and also afterward.
And also after.
Exactly. And to add another layer to this mystery, the Bible also records that the Israelites encountered these very Nephilim, these giants, over 1,000 years after the flood was supposed to have eradicated all life outside Noah's Ark.
So for you, our curious listener, this immediately begs a profound question. How could these Nephilim have possibly survived the deluge if the flood was truly universal in its destruction, as Genesis initially suggests? Does this imply a contradiction within biblical consistency itself, or is there a deeper layer of understanding we're missing in these ancient narratives?
That's the central enigma, yeah. And our diverse sources offer a few compelling theories to try and unravel this apparent contradiction. The first interpretation suggests a selective eradication.
Selective? How so?
Well, while Genesis emphasizes God wiping out all land creatures, this could be seen as specifically targeting God's natural order of creation. The Nephilim, being arguably unnatural creations resulting from the illicit union of fallen angels and human women, might not have been subject to the same, all-encompassing destruction.
Okay, so the idea here is that God's primary action was aimed at eliminating the contamination of his intended creation to essentially start anew.
Yeah.
And the destruction of the Nephilim was maybe a kind of side benefit, not the main goal.
That's the thinking in this theory, yes. Under this view, some Nephilim might have survived on their own accord, maybe through some inherent resilience, or even through unauthorized help from their corrupt procreators, the fallen angels themselves.
Unauthorized help. That's interesting.
This specific line of reasoning, intriguing as it is, finds some alignment with what's sometimes called pantheistic mythology. In those worldviews, the concept of a divine will can sometimes be temporarily challenged or even sort of triumphed over by the free choice of rebellion from lesser divine or semi-divine beings.
Right, like the gods in Greek myths often doing their own thing.
Exactly. It's a theme we see echoed across various cultures, providing a kind of framework for how unnatural elements might persist despite a divine decree.
Okay, what's the next theory?
A second theory, perhaps a bit more straightforward, proposes that the Genesis statement of destruction was more general in scope, rather than absolutely universally literal. Meaning, if some Nephilim somehow survived, then it's not too hard to reason, as our sources put it, that maybe a few humans and certain animals might also have miraculously survived outside the Ark.
Okay, so not everyone except Noah's family died.
Potentially. This perspective, the sources argue, helps resolve the existence of those otherwise unaccounted for races that the Israelites later encountered during the Exodus. It suggests the Old Testament's literal application of total destruction might have been specific to the Sethites, Noah's direct lineage, and not necessarily a blanket statement for all other surviving peoples around the globe.
Right. That makes some sense in explaining later encounters, but you said the sources lean towards a third theory.
Yes, while those first two theories offer plausible responses, our primary source material leans more heavily into a third explanation, which it considers the most logical and biblically acceptable solution. This theory posits the possibility that fallen angels procreated once more, sometime after the flood.
After. Okay, how does that work?
Well, the argument is that Scripture doesn't explicitly specify how many times this violation against creation occurred. It only says that the angels involved in the first act, the pre-flood one, were subsequently locked away in the abyss.
Ah, so it doesn't explicitly forbid a second round?
Not explicitly, no. And here's where this idea really sparks fascinating possibilities. Julian Morgenstern, a scholar writing way back in 1939, suggested there might have been two separate angelic falls. The first, pre-flood, driven by lust and disobedience, as Genesis 6 suggests. The second, post-flood, driven more by pride, a deliberate act meant to spite God and re-corrupt humanity.
Wow. Okay, pride and spite. And this connects back to Genesis 6.4.
Exactly. This interpretation re-examines that key verse. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. This pivotal verse can be interpreted in two ways. Either it means some Nephilim survived the flood,
Right.
or it means fallen angels copulated with women both before and after the flood.
I see the distinction.
And our source's conclusion is that the most logical and biblically acceptable solution is that remaining fallen angels, those not locked away after the first transgression, repeated the same violation post-flood, primarily in an act of revenge and spite against God.
This truly opens up a Pandora's box of possibilities, as they say. It even connects to later biblical events like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
That's the suggestion. That city's downfall, marked by sexual perversion partnered with Nephilim, which led to divine judgment by fire, is presented as a likely suspect for a second violation by these angels and their offspring.
That's a very different reading of Sodom.
It is. Of course, a crucial caveat here, as the source points out, is that Scripture is pretty much void of further information on the exact nature or timing of a potential second fall. However, this theory is presented as the soundest one that keeps the integrity of the Bible intact, allowing for both the flood's totality regarding the natural order and the later appearance of Nephilim.
But there's a challenge for this theory, too.
Yes. The main challenge is that it doesn't fully account for those surviving human refugees from the 4 races of humankind scattered around the globe, a point we'll definitely explore in more detail later.
Which brings us, I guess, to the fourth alternative solution.
Exactly, one that hides within the legends of other societies of antiquity and their own often very intimate relationship with giants. What's particularly striking here, and the source really emphasizes this, is how the Nephilim narrative inexplicably contains a consistent common history, no matter which reference to prehistory one chooses to study.
So these other myths, they aren't just random stories.
The argument is no, they're not. These divergent polytheist legends are seen not as contradictions to the biblical account, but as elemental pieces filling in the amnesia gaps of prehistory, providing an alternative, maybe complementary perspective to the primarily Sethian account of survival we get in Genesis.
Filling in the gaps. I like that.
And this universality, our sources argue, this sheer consistency across cultures, is just too compelling to be mere coincidence. 2, echoes of giants and gods across ancient civilizations.
Okay, so let's dive into those other legends, starting with the Sumerians, some of the oldest written stuff we have.
Right, the Sumerian narratives. These traditions, mainly derived from ancient Assyrian tablets, which copied even older Sumerian ones, actually predate our current biblical records. Now, that doesn't automatically mean they were the original source documents, but they're incredibly old.
And they talk about the first humans.
They do. Sumerian traditions speak of the first humans as the blackheads, or the black-headed people. That's what the Antediluvian Sumerians called themselves.
Blackheads. Why that name?
Well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Could it have been descriptive? Perhaps, as some sources speculate, contrasting them with the blonde and red-headed Nephilim that other accounts describe. It's a compelling little detail.
Definitely sparks curiosity. And what about their legends?
Their legends are incredibly intriguing because they explicitly state that all tools, weapons, and marvelous inventions were provided to them by the gods.
Everything from the gods.
That's what they claimed. And consider this. The Sumerian language itself, it's completely distinct, unrelated to any other known language families, which further suggests, to some researchers, that it too came from the gods.
Wow. So this implies
Yeah.
a period before civilization?
Exactly. It implies a period of perhaps uncivilized nomadic blackheads before a specific turning point of history towards civilization, a period not explicitly detailed in the biblical account focused on Adam's line. Sumerian tablets even claim that their knowledge of historical events before civilized man was created came directly from the heavenly Anunnaki gods.
The Anunnaki, we hear that name a lot.
We do. And what's truly fascinating is the stark contrast here. We have evidence of, say, Neolithic man from around 3300, 4000 BCE, largely stalled at hunter-gatherer technology, not leaving behind complex stories like this. Yet the Sumerians appear in Mesopotamia around 3500, 4500 BCE, and boom, they establish complex writing by 3200 BCE. This sudden, almost inexplicable rise of highly advanced technical civilizations like Sumeria, Egypt, and even the legendary Atlantis.
All of which, as the source notes, liberally intermingled with the gods.
Precisely. It strongly hints at some kind of profound external intervention.
Okay, and the creation of these blackheads themselves, is that significant?
Deeply symbolic, according to the texts. They were said to be created at Nippur, a place often referred to as where heaven bonds with the earth. The first blackheads, Alagara and Zalgara, were created in plural, male and female at the same time, with a clear mandate. Multiply, till the soil, erect buildings, and serve the curious, shadowy Anunnaki.
Tenants in the garden of the gods.
That's how they saw themselves. And this makes you consider, as the source does, were these blackheads perhaps part of that broader race of people created on day 6, mentioned briefly in Genesis, separate from Adam?
The people before Adam and Eve's specific creation.
That's the connection the source explores. It posits a central hypothesis connecting these narratives. That Cain and his progeny, perhaps guided by dark angels, eventually reigned over the people of day 6. They might have provided them with Cain's royal dragon bloodlines, a concept we'll touch on more, and taught them these spurious 7 sacred sciences, forbidden knowledge not of divine origin.
And this explains Sumeria's sudden rise.
This, the source argues, consistently accounts for the sudden, baffling, and instantaneous rise of the Sumerian civilization, offering an explanation rooted in this alternative lineage and illicit knowledge, something secular history often struggles to explain adequately.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. What about the Babylonian Eden? You mentioned that earlier.
Right, the Babylonian parallels are fascinating. A stunning mural discovered in Moria City, dated to around 1750 BCE, depicts an Eden surprisingly similar to the biblical one. You see winged cherubim guarding the entrance, and 4 streams flowing from a jar clearly representing the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates.
Unmistakable. And the key scene.
The most compelling scene shows a king, strongly suggested by context and other texts to be Cain, being invested by the Mesopotamian fertility goddess Ishtar. Ishtar is a figure whom Eve is closely associated with in many ancient myths. This Babylonian Eden, by the way, was known as the Land of Dilmun.
So Cain receiving kingship from an Ys-like figure in a garden guarded by cherubim. That's pretty specific.
It is, and it connects to Zecharia Sitchin's intriguing conjecture derived from various ancient texts. He suggested 2 distinct human creations, both involving gene manipulation of primitive hominids by the Anunnaki.
2 creations.
Yes. The first, aligning potentially with day 6 of Genesis, produced intelligent, rapidly reproducing nomadic hunter-gatherers who later became a kind of massive workforce for the gods. The second creation, much later, involved figures named Adapa and Titi, procreated through a selected female from among the blackheads of day 6 and the god Enki.
And these were different.
Far superior in intelligence and speech, described as civilized beings, which again eerily echoes the idea of Cain's alternative, perhaps divinely but illicitly influenced, creation or lineage separate from the Adamic line.
So does all this ring familiar, as the source asks, with the Genesis account concerning Adam, Eve, Cain, and those mysterious people of day 6?
Our source certainly suggests that connecting Cain to these people of day 6 and the blackheads exponentially increases the likelihood that the Sumerians, in their view, partook in the second creation of Nephilim, adding a whole new layer to their origin story beyond just the Watchers on Mount Hermon.
A second type of Nephilim almost, linked to Cain.
Possibly. It's a truly fascinating connection to consider. And another element is the Sumerian tradition of the breath of the gods.
How does that compare to Genesis? Adam received God's breath.
Right, but while Adam was given God's breath, the Sumerian account claims the breath given to Ulagara, and Zalgara was intended to transform them into godlike demigods, or even fully evolved gods. This pantheistic concept is seen by the source as possibly reflecting Cain and Lilith's infusion of royal bloodlines from their own alternative, maybe heavenly creation.
Lilith, another figure associated with non-Adamic lines.
Exactly. This then raises a provocative question. Were descendants of Cain and Lilith figures like Enoch the Evil, Lamech, Tubal-Cain, and Nama in truth Nephilim, and potentially initially immortal?
The theory, then, is that Sumerian mythology strongly advocates Oligara and Zalgara as a distinct strain of Nephilim.
Yes, directly connected to Cain and the people of Day 6. But importantly, distinct from the Nephilim created later on Mount Hermon by dark angels. It makes you wonder, as the source speculates, if the Oligara and Zalgara legends are the Blackhead's own recollection of Cain and Lilith, usurping kingship and infusing a unique variety of Nephilim bloodlines into the people of Day 6.
Okay, that's a lot to digest from Sumeria and Babylon. What about Greece and the Mediterranean?
The parallels continue, and they're quite striking. It really leads to the question, are these stories merely a retelling of the Nephilim and Antediluvian narrative from a polytheist perspective?
So Uranus and Gaia, Father Sky, Mother Earth.
Exactly. Greek mythology famously recounts Uranus cohabitating with Gaia, a union that produced not just the gods we know, but a new race of gods called the Titans, along with the Cyclops and, significantly, 300 other giants.
300 giants. And the names, like Gyges.
Right. Gyges, meaning giant, gives us our very word gigantic. Other well-known giants like Briareus, Typhon, and Atlas are all part of these legends. Even Josephus, the prominent Jewish historian from the early 1st millennium CE, recognized back then that the misdeeds of fallen angels described in texts he knew closely paralleled the legends of the Greek gods and titans found in epics like Hesiod's Theogony.
So Josephus saw that connection too.
Yeah.
And Theogony covers similar ground to Genesis.
Yeah, absolutely. What's truly compelling is that Theogony, much like Genesis 6, focused on the rise and fall of the Antediluvian Golden Age, the emergence of the giant races, and the devastating universal flood. The narrative structure is remarkably similar.
And the word gigantes.
Its etymology is key. Gigantes means earthborn, directly connecting them to Gaia, Mother Earth. This leads to what our source calls the most important doctrine of antiquity,
Which is
that all Titans shared the same fundamental origin. They were earthborn from Gaia in Greek mythology and from the seed of the gods. They were beings from heaven, the spirit, and beings from the earth, the flesh, just as Nephilim were in the biblical account. This shared hybrid ancestry across mythologies points to a deeply ingrained ancient concept.
Okay, and Egypt, similar echoes there.
Remarkably similar. We find Isis, known as the mother womb of the earth, impregnated by Osiris, or the sun god Re, producing Horus and a whole demigod dynasty. Isis is also celebrated as the Great Mother.
And in Sumeria again.
There's the figure Ninhursag, or Ninkursag, whose name translates as Lady of the Mountain. She's also revered as the Mother Goddess, Womb Goddess, and explicitly Mother Earth.
The universal theme seems undeniable.
It really is. Greek, Egyptian, and Sumerian mythologies consistently record various copulations of gods with Mother Earth, or with human women of the earth, which, just as they did in Genesis, produced giants as their progeny. Ninhursag, also known as Ninkai, or Lady Earth, was a pivotal figure. Her sons, these mighty men anointed into kingship, were referred to as the earthly Anunnaki, strikingly similar to the Nephilim.
And you mentioned a serpent lady connection.
Yes, a truly provocative detail from the Sumerian tradition. Ninkursag was celebrated as the serpent lady in their literature. This signifies her, in these esoteric readings, as the prevailing Grail Dragon Queen of the Ring Lords.
Dragon Queen, Ring Lords. This sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it? Her womb became famous within Grail, Dragon, Fairy, and Ring culture as the messianic succession of the uterine womb, the chalice of the Grail Queen, marking perpetual dragon succession and the maternal blood. This bloodline, known by names like Rosy Crucis or Starfire, was, in some traditions, believed to be a literal substance derived from these divine bloodlines, thought to confer healing and immortality. It's an esoteric but recurring theme linked to the nature of these demigods.
And the rings of kingship.
These themselves were seen as primary devices of the Anunnaki gods, used to establish earthly kingship from as early as 4000 BCE. Ninkursag, the Mother Earth figure, copulated with Anu Heaven, or Enki, Earth Water God, producing these mighty men of renown for kingships, the earthly Anunnaki. The Grand Assembly of the Anunnaki at Nippur reportedly held these powerful rings, which were used to bind kings to their divine oaths and lineage.
So these earthly Anunnaki were the rulers.
Our source suggests they were actually the illegal, evil potentates and kings of the Antediluvian epoch, and that these infamous rings of kingship were the very inspiration for tales like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and other legendary narratives about rings of power and the potential for corruption.
Fascinating connection. Okay, moving slightly geographically, what about Canaanite mythology?
In Canaanite myths, we find Astarte, the wife of Bel or Baal. She held titles like Great Mother of Fertility and the Queen of Heaven, titles remarkably similar to other pantheons like Ishtar in Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon, or Inanna in Sumeria.
And there's a specific fallen angel connection there.
A critical one, according to some sources. Ishtar is identified in certain traditions as the female human who slept with the fallen angel Azazel or Shemiaza, from whom she learned the true name of God.
Azazel, one of the chief fallen angels in Enochian texts.
Precisely. This immediately begs a fascinating question the source raises. Was Baal, the Canaanite storm god, or perhaps Uranus, the Greek father sky figure, actually the same Azazel?
Speculative, but intriguing. And this Mother Earth idea is everywhere.
Strikingly consistent across cultures. Universally, it represents the female womb that produced a race of giants through a union with a godlike male force. This includes figures like Spider-Woman in Native American traditions or Hard Beings Woman. The Sumerian epic Era in Isham directly supports this. It states that when Anu, the king of the gods, impregnated Earth, she bore the 7 gods for him, and he named them Sebeti, these being the divine angelic 7 sages.
7 sages, that number comes up a lot too. And the name Anunnaki itself.
Its etymology reveals this deep fusion. An, Sumerian for heaven, combined with ki, meaning earth, literally translates to heaven and earth. It describes these giant demigods born of the gods of heaven and the women of earth.
And there's a distinction between heavenly and earthly Anunnaki.
Yes, researcher Lawrence Gardner observed that some texts suggest 300 heavenly Anunnaki spawned 300 Igigi gods who remained on Earth as the earthly Anunnaki, a legend incredibly similar, again, to the 200 Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon in biblical apocrypha to mate with the daughters of Cain.
So many parallels.
It's hard to ignore. Scholar David Roll concluded these newly created Anunnaki, or Igigi, were earthbound gods akin to Nephilim that were of flesh and blood. Zecharia Sitchin even conjectured that 300 Igigi came from Mars, swore an oath to kidnap human females, and descended to Earth.
From Mars. Okay, that's Sitchin's specific take.
Right. These earthly Anunnaki, often depicted as mountain gods, then descended to the plains to intermarry with the Cainites, or the people of Day 6, as Sitchin suggests, the children of the rocket ship who were expelled to live among these interbred blackheads led by Cain's progeny.
And Enoch the Evil comes back into this.
He does. He's connected as likely part of the first race of Nephilim, perhaps that Cainite strain we discuss, distinct from the Genesis 6 Watchers' offspring. He's seen as the one who persuaded the blackheads of Day 6 to accept this newly formed second race of Nephilim, the Igigi, or earthly Anunnaki.
So the term Anunnaki itself means sons of Anu, but also connects to sons of God.
Yes, it can be interpreted as sons of God, or those lofty ones, angels, who came from heaven to earth, directly paralleling Genesis's Watchers.
And their role.
In ancient Sumerian legends, it's profoundly significant. They were patrons, founders, teachers, justices, technologists, and kingmakers. It's a role that directly parallels the activities attributed to the fallen angels in other traditions, like the Book of Enoch.
So they brought civilization, but maybe the wrong kind.
That's the implication. Our source emphatically states that baffling and unexplainable events from prehistory make it clear that dark angels and the 7 sacred sciences, that set of advanced forbidden knowledge, were clearly responsible for the rapid advancements that occurred in antediluvian Sumeria, Greece, and Egypt, as well as other mythical civilizations like Atlantis and Mu.
Okay, so in this new antediluvian society, you have the earthly Anunnaki as rulers, kings.
Right, the big men, the giants.
And the Cainites, Enochians, Sumerians, blackheads, they're the priests and sages.
That's the structure suggested. Enoch, often associated with the fire of Moanus, is remembered as the high priest of Enki, the god of the sea. These earthly Anunnaki were essentially the ring lords of Nippur. The Cainites were seen as the ones who could communicate directly with these gods.
But these earthly Anunnaki weren't full gods.
No, they were archons and rulers, not full gods themselves, but they eventually assumed the role of earthly gods. They became despotic potentates who imposed Enochian mysticism upon humankind through tyranny.
And this pattern shows up elsewhere, like with the Maya.
What's truly fascinating is the striking similarity to the Quiche Maya's Popol Vuh. It describes the Kohol, father god, and Olam, mother god, producing the lords of Zabulba. These lords were portrayed as blood enemies of humankind, inciting evil and violence resembling owls, vampires, and demons. Crucially, despite not being true gods, the text says they viewed themselves as gods.
Wow, that consistent pattern of powerful, non-divine beings dominating and corrupting early humanity. It really is remarkably consistent across such diverse ancient narratives.
It is indeed. 3. The Sacred Mountain and the Curse. Mount Hermon and its global parallels.
Okay, let's dive even deeper into the origins of these ancient civilizations. Our sources talk about legendary Sumerian city-states, the ones ruled by those Nephilim potentates we just discussed. Were they built by humans?
Not according to the legends, they were believed to have been created by the gods themselves in time immemorial.
Which implies?
It implies that the Sumerians may have only inherited these cities. It suggests that some antediluvian cities may have been much older than the epoch of Adam. Think about Jericho, for example. Archaeological evidence dates it back as far as 10,000 BCE.
Much older than usually thought.
Much older. And Sumerian tablets strongly support this notion of builder gods. They explicitly state things like, after the lofty crown and the throne of kingship had been lowered from heaven, he perfected the rites and the exalted divine laws, founded the 5 cities, Eridu, Bet-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak.
The 5 original cities.
Right. Other significant antediluvian city-states like Ur and Uruk, home to the famous Moon Temple, are also mentioned, reinforcing this idea of divine origins for these very early urban centers.
And then there's this myth of Zu. What's that about?
Zu. He was an Anunnaki figure, sometimes described as born of the earth, who apparently brought widespread chaos by seizing the sacred tablets of destiny from Nippur. Taking these tablets effectively suspended all societal norms, threw everything into disarray.
Chaos agent. And this introduces Enlil.
Yes, this legend introduces Enlil, a really powerful deity, often portrayed as an adversary to Enki, the god often linked to helping humanity or, in some views, corrupting it. Enlil is seen in Sumerian myth as the god most instrumental in bringing about the flood.
The flood bringer. Interesting. Some connect him to Adonai.
Yes, some pantheists controversially associate Enlil with Adonai, the god of the Israelites. It's a complex theological link made in some interpretations.
And these myths connect to specific locations, sacred mountains.
Absolutely. What's truly insightful here is how this pulls all the Sumerian allegories neatly together. The ancient city of Ekur, meaning mountain house, housed Enlil's temple, and it stood right beside Dur-Anki, a ziggurat known as the bond of heaven and earth.
Bond of heaven and earth.
And Nippur itself was considered the center of the earth. Similarly, the Akkadians believed Karsag was a sacred silver mountain, where heaven and earth met, as vividly described in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
So it all comes back to mountains.
It does. This directly connects all these Sumerian mythologies with Mediterranean and worldwide mythologies, where you constantly see gods recognized as Father Sky or mountains spawned with human females known as Mother Earth.
Okay, so a pattern emerges. What are the consistent themes?
3 really consistent themes pop out across all these ancient allegories. First, giants were universally born of Mother Earth. That's clear.
Got it.
Second, these giants were also born from the heavenly mountain, a sacred mountain, often considered the center of the earth, a place where heaven meets the earth, like Mount Hermon in the Enochian tradition.
Okay, Mother Earth and Heavenly Mountain.
And third, this mountain of heaven and earth is often presented as a profound allegorical sexual union itself. It's the meeting point, the place of creation.
A union, wow.
Yeah. The Tao tradition, for instance, refers to gods of the eastern sacred mountain as kings of the heavenly navel, symbolizing the earth's spiritual center, just like Nippur and even the legendary Atlantis were seen as world centers or navels.
And this connection between gods and mountains is reinforced elsewhere.
Definitely. Gods were often symbolized as planets or stars, and these celestial bodies were then closely associated with specific mountains. Think Zeus, identified with the planet Jupiter, ruling from Mount Olympus. Taoism, for example, records 5 element emperors transforming into 5 planets and 5 corresponding sacred mountains.
Which leads to a pretty big question.
A truly provocative question the source asks you to consider. Could these 5 mountains, or similar sacred peaks around the world, have been various manifestations of Mount Hermon, perhaps scattered among the 5 continents, marking sites of similar divine human, or rather angelic human interactions?
Mount Hermon everywhere. That's a mind-bending idea. And this explains ziggurats and pyramids.
That's the argument. They were constructed after the image of mountains, specifically designed to rejoin the heavens, symbolized by planets and stars, with their earthly, allegorical counterpart. They were meant to create a gateway to the gods, much like the infamous Tower of Babel was intended to do.
A gateway and a memorial.
Yes, they also served a profound purpose to memorialize the famous giants and their fathers, the Dark Angels. Ziggurats, for example, their name literally translates as towers rising into the sky, and they were revered as sacred mountains and off hills of heaven.
So the core meaning of this universal allegory.
It becomes strikingly clear across all these diverse narratives. In almost all pantheistic legends, angels acknowledged as gods, planets, stars, and personified as mountains of heaven cohabitated with human women who were known metaphorically in various cultures as Mother Earth.
The unholy union.
Exactly. This unholy union consistently produced giant demigods as offspring. These offspring then became the Antediluvian heroes, men of renown, just as Genesis testifies to, and it all consistently took place on these holy mountains.
The sheer uncanny consistency.
It's truly remarkable. Across such a vast array of cultures separated by geography and time, you find the same core narrative. It's difficult to just dismiss as mere coincidence. 4. The Great Deluge, dismissal by academia versus universal memory.
Okay, this undeniable consistency brings us squarely to the Great Deluge itself. A memory that, according to researcher Frank Joseph, is a common heritage throughout the world.
Yeah, he calls it the one great world myth that bizarrely binds us all to one birthright. And he notes importantly that the Old Testament account is but one of over 500 different and distinct recollections of the same set of events.
500, that's incredible.
It is. The very word cataclysm, he points out, stems from the Greek cataclysmos, which was always specifically assigned to the deluge event, emphasizing its singular, devastating impact in ancient memory.
So this memory survived. How?
Well, it's almost as if the profound memory of this event and of the Nephilim who were so intertwined with it was safeguarded among the diverse peoples of the world dispersed from Babylon or the far-flung peoples documented to have survived the flood.
Safeguard.
Our source contends, quite strongly, that the deluge is the most prominent historical fact binding all nations, all cultures, and all peoples of this world together. The uncanny and unaccountable consistency of memories, the flood itself, the Nephilim, their rebellion, the post-Diluvian resettlement is, they argue, simply not a mere coincidence.
And historian Susan Weisbauer agrees.
She reinforces this, yeah. She states that while science has documented many catastrophes throughout Earth's history, only the deluge resonates down the ages in all cultures. She calls it the closest universal story the human race has.
The closest universal story. So if this memory is so incredibly pervasive and consistent, why the widespread academic dismissal today? It seems odd.
It does seem odd, especially when you consider Josephus, that ancient Jewish historian we mentioned. He explicitly documented the flood and the reality of giants as common historical knowledge back in the early first millennium CE. He cited numerous barbarian historians, as he called them, people like Berosus the Chaldean, Mochus, Histiaeus, Hieronymus, Manasseh, Manetho the Egyptian, all of whom steadfastly recorded the flood as fact.
So it was accepted history then?
It seems so. Yet, as the source critically notes, modern academic circles often, quote, fanatically flaunt an undisclosed and clandestine faith in denying a global deluge, seemingly against a mountain of historical and mythological evidence.
A clandestine faith in denial. That's strong wording.
It is. Graham Hancock, the investigative journalist and author, critically observes this phenomenon. He notes that in many academic fields, almost any explanation, however harebrained, is more acceptable than the literal interpretation that there was a global flood.
Any explanation but the obvious one.
That's his critique. He even cites Alan Dundas, a UC Berkeley professor, who incredibly suggested that flood mythology is merely a metaphor for human birth, linked to the flood of amniotic fluid.
Wow. That seems reductive.
Extremely reductive. Hancock argues that archaeologists, ethnologists, and anthropologists frequently dismiss these striking similarities across cultures as simply coincidental, entrenched in exaggeration, and irrelevant as historical testimony.
But Susan Bauer pushes back.
Powerfully. As a historian, she argues that historians ought not to dismiss the flood, precisely because of these too many common coincidences. She cautions, quite pointedly, that many scientists and historians manipulate and invent findings and data, or permit their prejudices to bias their judgments, to advance their careers, leading to what she terms contrived claims of authority and accuracy.
So a critique of potential bias in academia itself.
Exactly. It highlights a significant intellectual tension and a potential bias within modern academia when confronted with a narrative so universally present outside of accepted historical frameworks.
What about Plato? He talks about floods too, right, in relation to Atlantis?
He does. Plato's Timaeus offers a fascinating contribution here. It recounts an Egyptian priest telling the Athenian lawgiver Solon, "You remember only one deluge, though there have been many."
I need deluges.
That's what the priest claims. But the focus, the priest says, should be on the last major deluge. And this is the one our source associates not only with the biblical flood, but also with the destruction of legendary lost civilizations like Atlantis, Mu, and Dwarka.
Okay, and the Bible itself might hint at Atlantis. You mentioned Isaiah.
Yes, the source points to the biblical book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 23, which offers what it describes as an encrypted prophecy. Now, on the surface, it appears to describe the destruction of the Phoenician city of Tyre, but it does so through forces of nature, earthquakes, floods, not the Assyrians who historically besieged Tyre. And remarkably, it calls Tyre an island when geographically it was primarily a coastal city with an island fortress nearby.
So inaccuracies that might be deliberate.
Yeah.
Coded language.
That's the argument. This particular passage in Isaiah, our source argues, actually holds encrypted markers for 3 distinct cataclysmic events. The historical destruction of Tyre, yes, but also a future destruction of Babylon and the fall of Atlantis.
Atlantis markers in Isaiah. Like what?
Several key points. First, Tyre is described as the bestower of crowns. This genetically echoes Nippur, the ancient Sumerian city we discussed, known as the center where heaven met earth and the home of the ring lords, where those Antediluvian Nephilim kings were supposedly anointed.
Okay, the crowns connection.
Second, the passage says God brought low the pride and glory of all the renowned of the earth through a watery global catastrophe. The source argues this wisdom applies pride figuratively to the reprobate Nephilim kings, who, as we saw, Genesis described as heroes of old and men of renown.
Pride, renown, water.
Got it. Third, the description that the island city was destroyed by the sea and trembling directly echoes the kind of deluge disasters that included earthquakes, volcanoes, and floods, cataclysms consistently associated in myth with the fall of Atlantis.
Earthquakes and floods. Makes sense.
Fourth, there's a mysterious note that survivors escaped the island city and disasters to settle in far-off lands. This points, the source suggests, to the legend of the 7 Atlantean sages who supposedly began anew to tutor the uncivilized and illiterate survivors of the human race after the flood.
The sages spreading knowledge again.
Exactly. And finally, the reference to Tyre as an old city serves as a profound primeval marker for the epoch before the flood, indicating an ancient pre-cataclysmic origin far beyond historical Tyre.
That's a lot of potential connections packed into one chapter. Who else talked about this stuff historically?
Berosus, yes. The Chaldean historian. He's a pivotal figure here. He was a priest of Belus Marduk in Babylon and a contemporary of Alexander the Great. He translated his 3-volume history, the Babylonica, into Greek. And it's widely believed he had unique access to pre-flood clay tablets stored in the temple archives at Sippar. This potentially made him one of the last inheritors of ancient Sumerian astrology, astronomy, and other ancient knowledge.
So he had access to really old records. Are his works still around?
Sadly, his major works are largely lost, probably casualties of time and events like the burning of the Library of Alexandria or neglect after the fall of the Roman Empire. However, crucial fragments of his writings survive because they were quoted by later historians like Josephus, Syncellus, and Eusebius. This gives immense credibility to the ancient accounts they preserve.
And what did Berosus record?
He famously recorded the first 10 generations to the Epoch of the Gods, a list remarkably similar in structure to the Antediluvian patriarchs in Genesis. He also described a strange, fish-like being named Oannes, who was supposedly the first god who taught civilization to early humanity.
The one is the fish god. We heard that name before.
We did. And our sources state that Berosus, in his interpretations, used Babylon, allegorically, to refer to a great antediluvian city, the first city, which they conclude could only have been Atlantis. Frank Joseph, whom we mentioned earlier, further supports this view. He believes that when the Bible describes Tyre and Babylon in these specific cataclysmic passages, it's actually describing the prosperity and eventual destruction of Atlantis, the sea-born antediluvian empire.
So Atlantis, The name itself evokes so much mystery, lost civilizations.
It really does. And modern Atlantean authors, drawing on Plato and other sources, claim its founder, Poseidon, was actually an angel or son of God, a watcher or ruler or archon.
A watcher, like the fallen angels.
That's the connection they make. They suggest Atlantis was the portion of the earth specifically allotted to this powerful being, a notion they see paralleled in Plato's Critias, and even, intriguingly, Deuteronomy 32.8, where the Most High supposedly divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God.
Okay, so Poseidon, a divine being, gets Atlantis. What did he do there?
He was the chief god and founder of Atlantean civilization, according to Plato. He constructed magnificent temples, cult centers, including his great bull cult temple in the capital city. In Atlantean heritage, the gods were seen as intermediaries between man and chaos, figures identified with watchers, archons, and even seraphim angels.
And the creation of Atlanteans involved.
Yeah.
That illicit union again.
Exactly. Central to the Atlantean narrative is the illicit union. Poseidon fell in love with Cleito, a human woman. Some accounts say she lived in a mountain, a familiar detail, isn't it?
Like Mount Hermon again.
Precisely. Poseidon also reportedly lain with many other daughters of men, producing offspring through these illicit violations.
And the offspring were.
They grew up to be giants and demigods, the Atlantean equivalent of the Nephilim. The female progeny also married heroes and other gods, becoming the first ancestors of the largest portion of the Antediluvian human race, according to these legends.
So a race of demigods founded Atlantis. And the 10 kings.
From this lineage with Cleito, Poseidon famously conceived 5 pairs of male twins. These became the celebrated 10 kings of Atlantis. Atlas was the eldest and leader, appointed as the first king and the official founder of Atlantis. These 10 powerful kings reigned absolutely over 10 distinct regions of the vast Atlantean empire and are often depicted wearing distinctive ram horn crowns, symbols of their power and lineage.
And the bull cult, that sounds significant.
Very significant in Atlantean religion. They celebrated the sacrifice of bulls in their holy temple, ritually spilling the bull's blood over an inscribed pillar containing their sacred oath. This is presented in the sources as the original antediluvian bull cult of giants, a cult that surprisingly seemed to flourish even post-diluvian in other cultures like Crete.
And they drank the blood.
Rulers would repledge their oaths by ritually consuming the bull's blood mixed with wine. The bull was Poseidon's sacred animal, and the Atlantean epic itself is often placed astrologically in the age of Taurus, the bull, roughly 4500–2300 BCE. Atlas, the first king, is even credited with founding Atlantean astrology.
And the source calls this blood drinking an abomination.
Yes, a Nephilim abomination. It notes, quite darkly, that Atlanteans tapped the holy dragon for blood, utilizing it for healing and immortalizing purposes under the famous Tree of Life, possibly referring again to that concept of starfire or divine essence.
Atlantis sounds like a place steeped in mysticism.
Completely steeped in all forms of mysticism, the source says. Its holy temple was known as the navel of the world, the Omphalos, considered the center for the first and oldest mystery religion. It's even suggested by our sources, quite controversially, that Atlantis was the first civilization to embrace, cultivate, and export the religion of Enoch the Evil, linking it directly back to the forbidden knowledge of the fallen angels.
Wow, and the Atlanteans themselves, what do they look like?
What's genuinely fascinating here are the consistent physical descriptions of Atlantean royalty across different cultural memories. Plato describes them as demigods, godlike giants. Other sources add details: golden hair, bold, strong heads, bright blue eyes, and voices that bellowed like Atlas from the depths of his mountain. The Greeks called them titans.
Golden hair, blue eyes, tall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And compare that to Egyptian descriptions of figures they associated with this era or region. Fair skin, very tall, and certainly much taller than Egyptians, being blonde and red-haired with beards, having sharp aquiline features, and having slanted eyes and oval heads.
Even Egyptians recorded this.
Apparently so. And even the Aztecs and Maya in Mesoamerica remembered ancient gods or founding figures as very tall, fair-skinned, and blonde or red-haired with beards and ruddy or rough skin.
That consistency across continents is uncanny.
It really bears an uncanny parallel to the biblical Nephilim descriptions, appearing in widely separated cultures.
Okay, so Plato is the main source for Atlantis. How credible is his account generally considered?
Well, his credibility for the Atlantis narrative largely stems from his unfinished dialogues, Critias and Timaeus. Crucially, characters within his works explicitly testify to Atlantis as historical fact and not a legend.
So the characters in the story say it's real.
Right. And ancient historians widely agreed that Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who supposedly first heard the story in Egypt, was a real historical figure. Critias, who recounts the tale in Plato's dialogue, was also a real historical figure, Plato's relative. This lends a layer of historical grounding to the account.
Yeah, Plato's student confirmed it.
Yes, Plato's student Crantor reportedly embraced the narratives as factual and even composed commentaries on them. He supposedly traveled to Cayce in Egypt about 300 years after Solon, specifically to confirm Plato's account. He claimed to have interviewed Egyptian priests and read ancient hieroglyphs etched on columns that testified to the Atlantean narrative, validating Plato's story.
Wow. And other ancient writers mentioned Atlantis.
Yes, quite a few. Figures like Pseudo-Aristotle, Marcellus, Diodorus Siculus, Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Posidonius, Strabo, they all made references that suggest Atlantis was a known concept or legend in antiquity. These narratives were then passed down to medieval scholars, often via Arabian geographers.
And Plato himself, he had connections to mystical traditions.
He did. He was a student of Socrates, of course, but later sojourned extensively through Italy, Sicily, Africa, and Egypt. He forged close ties with Orphic and Pythagorean mystical circles, which drew heavily from ancient Egyptian mysticism. This rich intellectual and spiritual background suggests he likely had a deep familiarity with the esoteric traditions and ancient knowledge that very probably informed his accounts of Atlantis.
Okay, so Atlantis wasn't just a city, it was an empire.
According to the legends, yes. Truly global in its extent. It was described as a mighty warring and conquering empire made up of 10 separate but allied kings and kingdoms ruled by Poseidon and Plato's Titan offspring.
10 kingdoms.
And it supposedly reigned over vast areas of northwest Africa, including modern Libya and Egypt, and southwest Europe as far as Italy. Specific regions sometimes mentioned in connection to its influence or colonization include the Yucatan Peninsula, northern South America, Portugal, Morocco, Ireland, and even England. It suggests a truly vast, interconnected civilization, a global powerhouse.
But it fell. How did that happen?
What's fascinating here is the depiction of Atlantis' decline, as told by Plato. For many centuries, wisdom and moderation held sway, and the Atlanteans were renowned as great engineers and architects.
The Golden Age phase.
Right. However, as their divine spark, their immortal spirit, began to fade, so too did their judicious reign. This decline was explicitly attributed by Plato to further interbreeding with humans, which diluted their demigod bloodlines over generations.
That sounds familiar, like Genesis 6 again.
It strikingly echoes Genesis 6, where God decreed the removal of that illegal immortal spirit from Nephilim posterity, shortening their lifespans because their corruption grew too great.
So as they became more human, they became corrupted.
That's the narrative. And like the giants described in the Book of Enoch, these Atlantean demigods, in these accounts, perhaps knew their physical bodies were dying, though their immortal spirits were not, and would, in many traditions, roam as disembodied, malevolent spirits or demons.
And they got angry.
In their rage and frustration, they vented their fury on the apples of God's orchard, the fruit of Adam, as one source poetically puts it. They rebelled against creation, waging war against both the higher gods and humankind. Plutarch described them as men possessing incredible force of hand and swiftness of foot and strength of body, but tragically using these extraordinary gifts for inhumanity and cruelty. Figures like Hercules and Theseus in Greek myth were famed for killing many of these violent giants.
And the 10 kings themselves became corrupt.
Yes, the 10 corrupted demigod kings of Atlantis eventually ruled with a heavy hand, succumbing to unchecked power, wealth, and immense pride. They lost favor with the higher gods. Theosophist Helen Blavatsky noted that Atlanteans, originally perhaps natural mediums or psychically gifted, were eventually led astray into becoming black magicians, which ultimately contributed to their downfall and a great war.
A war against the gods.
Their warlike ambition displeased the gods, yes. Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, famously employed Hercules and other noble titans to fight alongside the Greeks against the Atlantean giants. Plato mentions that the ancient Athenians specifically checked Atlantean expansionist aggression.
And then came the judgment.
Exactly. The culmination of this epic saga. Zeus, decidedly distraught by the corruption, gathered the pantheon at the center of the world. A place likely referring, again, to Nippur or a similar sacred cosmic center to inflict punishment. This mirrors Enoch's version of angels gathering at God's will before decreeing the flood, earthquake, and volcano cataclysm.
So how was Atlantis destroyed?
According to Plato, after losing the war to the Athenian alliance, Zeus and other powerful gods, including Poseidon himself, or Jupiter Neptune in Roman and African legends, destroyed Atlantis with a devastating cataclysm of earthquakes and floods. Zeus sent torrential rains from above, and Poseidon unleashed waters from beneath the earth. It's an image that eerily echoes both biblical and even Quranic testimonies of the deluge involving waters from both heaven and earth.
And the survivors?
The myths universally hint that this cataclysmic flood swept away an advanced civilization that had infuriated the gods, sparing only the unlettered and the uncultured, forcing the few survivors to essentially begin over like children.
The second chance idea again, like Noah.
Exactly. It reflects that same theme. What's compelling is how these stories appear universally. In Vedic India, pre-Columbian Americas, Egypt, Sumeria, Babylonia, Greece, Arabia, China, Southeast Asia, Northern Europe, the Pacific, everywhere. Universally, where truly ancient traditions have been preserved, the source states, even among mountain peoples and desert nomads, vivid descriptions have been passed down of global floods.
Okay, but what sparked the cataclysm? Just angry gods or something more physical?
That's a point of particularly fascinating detail. Gnostic, Mesopotamian, and Jewish legends broadly concur that this worldwide cataclysm involved more than just a flood. It was inclusive of earthquakes, volcano eruptions, tornadoes, and hurricanes, strongly reminiscent of those prophetic descriptions in Isaiah 23.
So a whole complex of disasters.
Right. And the mythical Greek legend of Phaethon, the son of the sun god Helios, or Apollo, who lost control of the sun chariot, scorched the earth, and then crashed it into the ocean, sparking the deluge, is often interpreted as reflecting catastrophes caused by heavenly bodies.
Something from space.
That's a consistent theme across numerous legends. The deluge was sparked by something crashing from the sky, whether a meteorite, an asteroid, or some powerful outside influence. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes dams releasing, but also the 7 judges of hell lighting up the land, day becoming night, and the land being smashed like a cup.
Sounds cosmic.
It does. The 5th century Greek poet Nonnos wrote of Zeus hurling a world conflagration at the Titan kings. The Norse Edda tells of a god hurling stars into the ocean. The Mayan Chilam Balam speaks of great pieces of smoke that fell from the sky.
Smoke from the sky.
India mentions Brahma casting celestial projectiles. The Zoroastrian Zendavesta describes a 3-headed star falling from the sky, causing the oceans to boil.
A 3-headed star.
Wow. And the Pleiades connection?
Yes, many of these legends strangely wrap themselves around allegories concerning the constellation of the 7 sisters, the Pleiades. In various mythologies, the Pleiades were sometimes called the Atlantises, daughters of Atlas, who were raised to immortality. Mayan survivors were even said to have ascended to the Pleiades after the flood.
So the stars were involved, maybe even the destination for some.
It seems so. Hopi, Cherokee, Iroquois, Aztecs, Hawaiian, Japanese, and West African traditions all link the Pleiades cluster to the deluge, often describing stars crashing down or having fiery tales associated with the cataclysm.
Orion. Greek legends often link Orion, the great celestial hunter, to the Pleiades. Orion is also sometimes linked mythologically to Azazel, the chief angel held accountable for bringing about the deluge in Enochian lore. Intriguingly, Orion in some myths was born from Poseidon, sea god, and Gaia, earth mother.
The connections keep weaving together. Does the Bible mention these stars in relation to the flood?
There are passages that seem to subtly connect these specific celestial bodies to flood events and divine judgment. Job 38.31 asks, "Can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords from Orion?" Amos 5.89 speaks of, "He who made the Pleiades and Orion, who calls for the water of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land," a very flood-like image. Job 9.9 mentions God making the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. And Psalm 18.7-16 offers that incredibly vivid poetic description of God's anger causing earthquakes, fire, dark clouds, hailstones, lightning, thunder, and exposing the valleys of the sea.
It definitely paints a picture of cosmic upheaval.
It really does. Our source's final conclusion on this is compelling. Atlantis, in this view, is merely a recantation as part of the worldwide deluge cataclysm recorded in the Old Testament, suggesting a singular, globally impacting event remembered in different cultural languages. The Golden Age, lost knowledge, and the survival of races.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly now to an era that supposedly predates the deluge. The first time, or the Golden Age. This period seems universally remembered across cultures, doesn't it?
It really does. Consistently recalled as an era of near perfection, free from disease and death, where everything was good, almost idyllic.
What are some examples? Egypt.
In Egyptian mythology, their golden age, known as Zep Tepi, the first time, was ruled by the entry gods, a term that intriguingly translates to one who watches, echoing those watcher angels. Figures like Osiris and Horus ruled during this time. It was remembered as a carefree time with no toil, no care, abundant resources, incredibly quick pregnancies, and children born already walking, a time when magic and sorcery flourished.
Sounds like paradise, India.
Indian myth similarly describes an age of Sattva, an age of pure goodness, characterized by a carefree life with no work, a perfect climate, and a complete absence of sadness.
Sumeria, too.
The Sumerians remembered their golden age through those 5 great city-states that flourished before being violently ended by that ferocious flood.
And Rome.
Roman mythology, particularly Ovid, recalls a perfect golden age that tragically deteriorated through subsequent lesser ages, silver, bronze, and finally the Iron Age. This last age was marked by greed, disloyalty, constant war, and significantly hubris-driven giants rebelling against the gods, ultimately ended by a great flood that spared only Deucalion and Pyrrha.
So a common pattern of decline from perfection ending in flood. What else did these golden ages share?
A key characteristic across all these accounts is that true wisdom prevailed, and crucially, knowledge itself was seen as having been gifted to them at the genesis of their civilization, directly from the gods.
The knowledge came from outside again.
Right. However, these ideal conditions, ironically, also fostered arrogance to form, causing their rebellion against God, or the gods leading to their downfall.
And the rulers were divine or semi-divine.
In Egyptian myth, yes. The land was allotted to gods who then procreated Nephilim, these immortal human gods and demigods like Osiris and Isis. The ancient historian Manetho even listed Osiris as the 5th king of this demigod dynasty, preceded by others including Kronos.
Kronos, who shares a name with one of the famous twin founders of Atlantis.
Exactly. It hints again at these interconnected mythologies and lineages.
And there was corruption even in Egypt's golden age, that blood-drinking story.
Yes, there's an alarming recollection in Egyptian mythology. Ra, the sun god, warned that humankind had grown too wicked and was actively rebelling. Hathor, a powerful goddess, was sent to quash the rebellion, and she savagely drank sacrificed blood blended with a concoction of fruit and barley, a kind of ritual blood beer or wine.
Chilling, and the source connects this to...
Directly links this chilling detail to the consumption of starfire that was a notable crime committed by Nephilim in Atlantis, suggesting a dark, shared practice related perhaps to achieving immortality or tapping into forbidden power.
So, another link between Atlantis and Egypt.
It further connects them as very advanced civilizations, both seemingly owing their extraordinary knowledge not just to divine favor, but specifically to the spurious knowledge of Cain and the illicit knowledge of heaven, that forbidden knowledge not meant for humanity.
And this leads to the idea of the pyramids and Sphinx being memorials.
Exactly. Researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval believe the Giza monuments were constructed as profound memorials to the flood itself and prologue to a highly advanced civilization that was destroyed by it. This idea parallels biblical legends where figures like Cain and his progeny erected magnificent monuments, often explicitly to immortalize their names and their power against the ravages of time or judgment.
But the dating. Conventional Egyptology places the pyramids much later, right? Around 2500 BCE with Khufu.
That's the standard view. But our source highlights disquieting evidence suggesting the Sphinx and Great Pyramids were built well before Khufu in 2400 BCE, directly challenging that conventional timeline.
What kind of evidence?
Well, for instance, the Great Pyramid itself is apparently depicted in hieroglyphs that date long before Khufu's reign. The Victory Tablet of King Menes, dating from around 2950-3100 BCE, clearly depicts a pyramid structure. And the Inventor Stela, an inscription found near the Sphinx, credits Khufu not with building the Great Pyramid, but with restoring it, implying it was already ancient in his time.
Restoring it, that's a big difference.
It is. Writings from the Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie in 1901 CE also found Sphinx depictions on tablets dating back to the time of Menes, Narmer, and Zur, very early dynastic rulers. Even Sumerian cuneiform texts, which predate Egyptian dynastic history, depicted pyramid-like structures.
What about other dating methods? Cayce and Sitchin.
Figures like Edgar Cayce, the renowned psychic, and Zacharias Sitchin, the ancient astronaut theorist, also contribute to this unconventional timeline. Samples taken from the Great Pyramid, tested by the ARE, Cayce's foundation, in 1986, yielded dates between 2900-3800 BCE. But Cayce himself spoke in his trance readings of an even older civilization dating to around 10,500 BCE as the true builders of the Sphinx and pyramids. Sitchin, too, concluded the pyramids were built by the heavenly Anunnaki around 10,500 BCE.
Okay, those are more esoteric sources. Is there any geological evidence?
Crucially, yes. Geological confirmation supports this much ancient dating. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist, and Dr. Thomas de Becky, a geophysicist, conducted seismic studies around the Sphinx in 1991. They confirmed that the distinctive vertical scarring or erosion on the body of the Sphinx and the walls of its enclosure was etched primarily by water. Specifically, heavy rainfall sometime well before 7000 BCE, likely much earlier during a wetter climate period in Egypt.
Water erosion, not wind and sand.
Primarily water, according to their findings. John Anthony West, who first championed the water erosion theory based on Schwaller de Lubitsch's work, argues this pushes the Sphinx's origin potentially beyond 10,000 BCE. This geological evidence significantly pushes the timeline of these colossal monuments much further back into prehistory, well before any conventionally recognized ancient Egyptian civilization capable of such feats is thought to have existed.
It's huge. And the Sphinx itself, the lion shape, is that significant?
Profoundly symbolic, according to these interpretations. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for Tepiawe, meaning first ancestors or ancestral deities, was a large slouched lion, unambiguously reminiscent of the Sphinx.
A lion representing the first ancestors.
Right. Hancock believes the Sphinx is indeed a lion originally and was built specifically in the astrological age of Leo, which corresponds roughly to 10,970, 800, and 810 BCE. This slouching lion hieroglyph was also used to represent the shadowy gods, the ancestors of Re, the Akaru.
The Akaru. And Akar means lion.
Yes, Acre means lion or sphinx. The idea is that these lion characteristics depicted the founding watchers of Egypt, those original entre gods.
This connects to cherubim, too.
The parallels are striking. The biblical cherubim, the guardians of sacred spaces, are often described with 4 faces: man, lion, ox, and eagle, remarkably similar iconographically to the composite nature sometimes associated with the Sphinx. The word cherub itself derives from the Assyrian karbu, meaning he who prays or intercedes or even to ride. These were typically winged creatures guarding temples and palaces. Griffins, often called winged sphinxes, were commonly known in antiquity as dragons.
So not like the chubby baby angels often depicted later.
Definitely not. Think powerful, hybrid guardian beings. The source draws an analogy, perhaps controversially, not to cherubim directly, but to centaurs in Greek myth, half man, half horse, born from Ixion and a cloud shaped like Hera who became violent, an outlawed race bred by rebellious gods.
Okay, so the Sphinx as a monument to what or who?
The source poses a provocative question. Was the Sphinx a monument to Satan and adore his fallen allies? Sphinx comes from the Egyptian Shisep Anka, meaning living image. Adamrera, the supreme creator god in some Egyptian theologies, often depicted as a sphinx and regarded as the father of the gods with lion sphinx cherubim characteristics, had the sphinx monument known as Sheshop Ankh, the living image of Atum. Was it a monument to the creator or something else?
This ties into the whole hierarchy of pantheons.
It does. You see these complex hierarchies everywhere. In Egypt, Ta, sometimes depicted with 2 coiled serpents like a DNA helix, was considered the supreme force by some. Below him were figures like Ratum, the creator. The Sumerian rival was Anu. The male creator often had a female counterpart, like Sophia in Gnosticism or Lilith in Jewish folklore. Other powerful male deities included Enlil, the Gnostic Eldabaoth, the Canaanite El Adonai Adonis. It becomes clear, as the source states, that these Atlantean markers and motifs, serpents, lions, watchers, divine hierarchies, permeate Egyptian and most pagan mythologies, suggesting a common, incredibly ancient root.
Okay, let's talk about the followers of Horus. Who were they?
Yes. A curious group in Egypt, according to our sources, whose legacy supposedly continued well after the deluge. They were considered the bearers and preservers of knowledge.
Preservers of Atlantean knowledge.
That's the theory. They are said to have founded a cult of astronomer priests, tasked specifically with guarding Atlantean knowledge, religion, and technology. This cult, in turn, is believed to have spawned various Brotherhood Orders of the Snake, secret societies dedicated to preserving this ancient, perhaps forbidden wisdom.
The Snake Brotherhood. Sounds ominous.
These figures, sometimes called the Shebtu, were described as having a long-headed serpentine distinction and were also known as Urshu, meaning watchers. They function as divine intermediaries, akin perhaps to Enoch or Oannes' semi-divine order. They were the Shemsu-Hor, the companions or followers of Horus.
And scholars like Schwaller de Lubitsch thought they were important.
He believed these demigods and priests were the original mentors of pharaonic civilization. Figures like Osiris, described as a serpent king or god, and Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god, are presented in this light as bringers of civilization and the founders of their mystery cults of knowledge.
And the source of this knowledge.
Again, consistently attributed not to human ingenuity alone, but to the illicit knowledge of heaven and the seven sacred sciences, that precise set of forbidden disciplines received from the infamous seven fallen angels, naming specific watchers like Azazel Shemiaza, Amasis, Gadariel, and others from the Book of Enoch.
Manetho, the Egyptian priest, his history supports this long timeline.
It does. Manetho, writing around 250-300 BCE, provides a fascinating historical framework. He divided ancient Egyptian history into three distinct eras. First, the reign of the gods, Neteru. Second, the reign of the followers of Horus, Shemsu-Hor, these demigods or sages. And finally, the dynastic reign of human pharaohs, beginning with Menes around 2950 BCE.
And his dates go back. How far?
Manetho meticulously compiled an illustrious history, a king list dating back potentially 10,000 years before the flood, placing the start of divine rule somewhere between 13,000 and 14,000 BCE. He claimed the gods reigned for an astonishing total of 24,300 years before the demigods took over.
Are his lists considered accurate at all?
Remarkably so in many respects, especially for the later dynastic periods. He was a priest of Heliopolis with access to temple records, and his chronology finds support in other ancient Egyptian records like the Abydos Temple King List etchings, 14th century BCE, the Palermo Stone, c. 2400 BCE, and the Turin Papyrus, c. 1250 BCE, which itself starts its king list around 12,500 BCE. These align surprisingly well with Manetho's ancient accounts.
So these followers of Horus, or sages, survived the flood.
Egyptian mythology holds that surviving post-Diluvian companions of Horus salvaged and transported with them from the first time great knowledge from across the sea to Egypt, India, and China. These mysterious order of sages, who arrived from a distant island or continent, strongly implied to be Atlantis, were known as builder gods, senior ones, and followers of Horus.
And they rebuilt the world.
They are credited with rebuilding the post-Diluvian world, creating a new age of gods, and designing and building the colossal Egyptian monuments, as detailed in inscriptions known as the building texts found at temples like Edfu. Osiris himself likely belonged to this enigmatic group of post-flood civilizers.
And we see similar figures elsewhere, like the fish gods in Sumeria.
Exactly. Samuel Noah Kramer, the prominent Sumerologist, noted that Sumerian tradition records visits by semi-divine beings from the sea, often depicted as half fish, half human, like Oannes, who are commissioned to teach the arts of civilization. Sciences, math, writing, building.
Oannes again. Could his father have been Poseidon?
Kramer wonders that, especially given that Zeus and Vishnu also had fish forms in some myths, and Babylon itself was said to be founded by fish gods. And remember, Oannes is Mayan for he who lives in water, suggesting a widespread archetype of a civilizing being emerging from the sea.
And Oannes is connected to Enoch the Evil.
Intimately, in these interpretations, Oannes is seen as an alternative appellation for Enoch the Evil, also known as Uana Dapa. Berosus identifies the first sage as Oannes. This Enoch Oannes is positioned as the founder of the mortal order of Nephilim's seven sages, the group perhaps equivalent to the Atlantean companions of Horus. He was also a high priest of Enki, the god of the sea, and the leader of this brotherhood of fish gods.
So Enoch brought the giants down from the mountain.
This Enoch Oannes is believed to have brought the giants Nephilim and Anunnaki down from the mountain, specifically Mount Hermon, to intermix with the day six-led Cainites, thereby establishing Antediluvian kingship in partnership with the Dark Angels.
This created a king and priest partnership.
Yes, where Nephilim kings were paired with these seven seraphim sages, the fish gods, or their human successors. This dynamic is vividly depicted, the source argues, in later Grail legends. Think King Arthur advised by the mystical Merlin, or the Merovingian fisher kings, a wise magical figure guiding a royal leader.
And figures like Hermes and Thoth fit this role.
Precisely. Enoch, Hermes, Thoth, Mercury, they are consistently portrayed as counselors to kings, possessors of hidden secrets, acting as crucial intermediaries between the divine angelic and human realms. Roll suggests that the earthly sages, led by Oannes, were kin to the original seven seraphim sages, perhaps the Sebeti, part of the same ancient snake brotherhood as the Egyptian followers of Horus Sheptu.
And this brotherhood appears in India too.
As ascetic snake sages recorded in the Vedas. The source argues that both groups of antediluvian sages, Egyptian and Indian, are believed to have survived the deluge. They're consistently associated with fish and sea symbolism, credited with preserving civilization's gifts, acting as kingmakers, teaching profound spiritual and religious doctrines, and serving as royal advisors. It's presented as the same ancient brotherhood, manifesting in different cultural contexts.
And these sages were linked to the 10 Nephilim kings.
In Sumeria, yes. These divine teachers, the 7 sages, were crucial in importing concepts of astral kingship, divine knowledge, science, and reading omens. They were the main protagonists or advisors alongside the famous 10 Nephilim antediluvian ring lords, figures like Gilgamesh and the flood hero Utnapishtim-Zisudra.
Did they continue after the flood?
The legend suggests they did. These post-flood sages are said to have partnered with figures like Hermes and Nimrod at Babel. The Quran even mentions the angels Harut and Marut teaching witchcraft in Babylon. The Zoroastrian Zendavesta notes a figure named Yuma teaching post-Diluvian survivors and enforcing a banishment of giants.
And they hid their knowledge.
Supposedly, yes. Thoth, Hermes, and Enoch are said to have meticulously copied the secrets of the pre-flood world into books and secured them in hidden temples along the Nile, specifically in secret chambers of archives, and a legendary Hall of Records believed by some to be buried close to the Sphinx.
The Hall of Records. That's a famous legend. And modern groups claim this knowledge.
Modern esoteric groups like the Rosicrucians, the Theosophist Society, and Freemasonry are believed by some researchers like Hancock and Beauval to be the contemporary keepers of these ancient teachings, passed down through millennia. Edgar Cayce even prophesied that this Atlantean knowledge would eventually be rediscovered in hidden vaults located at the foot of the Great Pyramid or near the Sphinx. Enoch the Evil, sometimes called the first master mason, is even believed by these traditions to have built the pyramids and Sphinx as monuments and repositories for this knowledge.
So the chronology of rulers that emerges is complex.
It is, but there's a pattern. The first time, Zep-Tepi, equals the Neteru, Egyptian for gods, one who watches, the Watchers, ruled antediluvian Egypt first, perhaps building the early Sumerian cities too. Then came the Nephilim, the powerful demigods procreated by these fallen angels watchers. As their immortal spirit began to fade due to God's decree or interbreeding, these Nephilim became evil giant potentates. Finally, mortal human hybrids, perhaps descendants of these Nephilim kings mixed with human lines, inherited the throne around 2950 BCE, beginning with historical figures like Nimrod in Mesopotamia and Menes, the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt.
That's a radical reinterpretation of early history. What about Central America? Do we see echoes there?
Powerfully, yes. The Olmecs, flourishing around 3000 BCE, are credited with significant cultural developments in Mesoamerica, though the precise source of their advanced knowledge remains debated by mainstream archaeology. Some alternative theories believe they were in direct contact with Atlanteans or another giant-dominated society. Their own legends refer to their first fathers as powerful sorcerers and wizards.
And Quetzalcoatl fits in here.
Quetzalcoatl, the pivotal feathered serpent god, a bringer of civilization, is said to have preached to the Olmeca, teaching them advanced arts and crafts. Abbot Brasseur de Bourbourg, a 19th century scholar, believed Quetzalcoatl actually came from Atlantis.
Cayce mentions Central America too.
Edgar Cayce's prophecies distinctly state that Atlantean survivors escaped destruction and fled to both Egypt and Central America. He claimed they formed the Central American royal house of Atlan, led by a figure named Iltar. They reportedly buried repositories of their advanced knowledge in the Yucatan Peninsula, mirroring the hidden caches supposedly in Egypt near the Sphinx, with a third set left buried at Atlantis itself. Cayce also named 3 islands that supposedly remained after Atlantis' main destruction: Posadia, Arion, and Og.
And other codices mention this.
The Vatico-Latin Codex, an old manuscript, describes Atlantean survivors protecting large amounts of knowledge, including astronomy, geometry, agriculture, medicine, and those 7 spurious sciences knowledge carried by the Atlantean 7 sages, the same group as the followers of Horus.
And the Toltecs.
The Toltecs, who culturally descended from the Olmecs, were renowned as highly skilled silversmiths, a craft they were said to have been taught directly by Quetzalcoatl.
Okay, besides Atlantis, there are other legendary lost lands, Mu-Dwarka.
Yes. Mu is widely accepted in occult and theosophical traditions as another major antediluvian civilization, usually placed in the Pacific Ocean. Like Atlantis, it supposedly exploited advanced technology, including anti-gravity, and met a similar cataclysmic destruction. The ancient Indian Vedas are even believed by some esoteric traditions to originate in Mu. Mu is sometimes thought to have founded Lower Egypt, while Atlantis founded Upper Egypt, suggesting two major influences.
And Dwarka, that's in India.
Yes, the truly compelling underwater ruins of Dwarka have been found off the coast of northwest India. This was the sacred city of Lord Krishna in Hindu tradition. Archaeological finds there date well beyond 1500 BCE, suggesting great antiquity. Indian epics state it was destroyed by oceans rising dramatically at the onset of the Kali Yuga, the current Dark Age, dated traditionally to 3102 BCE, a date remarkably close to some biblical calculations for the deluge.
Wow. Another flooded ancient city.
And similarly, Mahabalipuram on India's southeastern coast, known mythologically as the City of the Giant, Bali, was also said to have been partially destroyed by a sea god encroaching on the land. Hancock concludes that Mahabalipuram, Dwarka, Atlantis, and the 5 antediluvian Sumerian cities all suffered an identical fate, pointing strongly toward a single immense global cataclysm.
So the picture emerging is of multiple advanced civilizations, possibly linked, all wiped out, and potentially multiple races involved.
Our source proposes that the Age of Atlantis, or the Antediluvian epoch generally, contained either 3 or 4 great civilizations and races that flourished simultaneously. The universal Golden Age theme, present in Greek, Atlantean, Indian, and Egyptian myths, consistently points to an age reigned over by divine kings. Critically, it asserts, based on these global myths, that refugees from 4 human races, along with Nephilim, indeed survived the deluge. While scripture specifically details Sethian survival through Noah, these other sources hint at a broader, multiracial survival.
4 human races.
Ancient Aryans and Egyptians explicitly recognized 4 primary human races in their art and texts, often depicted as white, Libyan Westerner, red Egyptian, black Nubian African, and yellow Asiatic. The Mayan Popol Vuh also supports this idea, describing 4 distinct peoples being created initially, who then multiplied and eventually spoke many different tongues. Geographically, the source tentatively places the black race in Africa south of Egypt, and the yellow race possibly in Mu, or the hypothetical lost continent of Sunderland in Southeast Asia.
And king lists support multiple pre-flood lineages.
Yes. Antediluvian king lists from Iranian legends mention 10 Pishtadian kings before the flood, mirroring Atlantis's 10 kings. The Sumerian king list, as recorded on the Weld-Blundell prism, lists kings reigning for incredibly long periods before the flood swept over. The Larsa list names Yusudra as the last pre-flood king.
The 10 kings constant.
It appears everywhere. Chaldean Berosus, Sumerian king lists, India, Brahma plus 9 Brahmadikas, the first Manus, China, 10 divine or immortal emperors of the Miaotzi, the Arabian Adites, even Odin's ancestors in Norse myth. All feature a list of around 10 pre-flood rulers who lived extraordinarily long lives.
Even Norse and Celtic myths have surviving giants.
Absolutely. Viking mythology starts with Ymir and Audumla, primeval giants who created Buri, the first god. It also speaks of builder giants who constructed Asgard but were later overthrown by the gods. Norse sagas even explicitly speak of 2 Titan-like survivors of Ragnarok, their end times cataclysm, Lif and Liftwazer, who hide in a wood and repopulate the world.
And Ireland and Wales.
Irish and Welsh legends are full of giants. The Tuatha De Danann, often described as fairy folk, were depicted as tall, beautiful, magical beings with very human personalities, possibly remnants of an earlier race. And then there were the Fomorians, often portrayed as monstrous beings descended from Noah's cursed son Ham's lineage, sometimes depicted as hairy, one-eyed, one-legged, much like the Greek Cyclops.
So these stories are everywhere.
The conclusion from our source is clear and compelling. The faint echoes of Atlantis, and the broader antediluvian world it represents, are too far-flung, too persistent, and too familiar among the diverse cultures of the world to be ignored. They argue these echoes coalesce into a choir, shouting to future generations about the validity and hypostasis, the underlying reality of the antediluvian epoch, their people, and their achievements, both good and evil. It suggests a truly global, shared memory of a lost age, powerful non-human entities, and a devastating cataclysm. 6. Dissecting the flood survivors, humans, Nephilim, and beyond.
Okay, let's really zero in on the flood survivors now, looking beyond just Noah. We have the famous Sumerian flood narratives, Gilgamesh, Zusudra, Atrahasis. How do they fit in?
They offer a crucial broader perspective. Now, many secular academics often look at these Mesopotamian accounts, which technically predate our current written biblical records, and conclude that the biblical writers simply borrowed from them.
The standard academic view.
Right. However, historian Susan Weisbauer, whom we've mentioned, offers a key counterpoint. She argues that these significant differences in detail robustly suggest they arose independently from the same cataclysm, meaning they're independent witnesses to the same event, not copies.
Independent accounts of the same flood. Okay, so the Epic of Gilgamesh, what does it say?
In the most famous version, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by the gods, specifically the god Ea, who is often identified with Enki, a figure sometimes linked by esoteric sources to benevolent or trickster fallen angels like Saklas, Prometheus, or Yaldabaoth, 7 days before the deluge hits. Utnapishtim builds a huge ark, saves animals, his immediate family, and significantly, kin and craftsmen. The flood itself in this version lasts 7 days.
Okay, similar structure to Noah, but different details. And Gilgamesh himself, who was he?
Gilgamesh himself is described as an extraordinary and fascinating individual. He's listed as the first post-Diluvian king of Uruk in the Sumerian king lists, but he's vividly described in the epic as an evil potentate, a tyrannical ruler who terrorized his citizens, building city walls with forced labor, and notoriously ruled like a wild bull who took any woman he chose, claiming a sort of droit du seigneur.
Not exactly a righteous figure.
Far from it. Yet he also held the title Atrachasis, meaning unsurpassed in wisdom, and was eventually deified, partly for surviving the era of the deluge or perhaps for bringing Utnapishtim's story back. He's portrayed as a warrior lord of great stature, a goring wild bull, perfect in strength, and crucially the text explicitly states he was 1/3 man and 2/3 god.
2/3 gone. How?
Because his mother was said to be the wild cow goddess Ninsun. This clearly marks him as a demigod, a Nephilim figure. The texts even give his height 11 cubits, which is about 16.5 feet tall. He would have dwarfed Goliath.
16.5 feet. Definitely a giant.
He was also recorded with the epithet Lilu, implying connections to spirits or demonic powers. Some traditions even described him as half man and half fish, or sons of a fish god, linking back to Oannes. He's explicitly called a Titan king, equivalent in status to figures like Horus, Zu, and Marduk, all powerful demigod figures, a tyrannical ruler in the spirit of his forefathers.
So, Gilgamesh, a post-flood king, was clearly Nephilim. Does this help explain other Nephilim?
Our source argues emphatically yes. If Gilgamesh was Nephilim, then can we identify other unexplained Nephilim involved in these Mesopotamian flood narratives? Consider Enkidu, the wild man created by the gods to be Gilgamesh's rival, who later became his closest friend. The texts describe Enkidu as also being a giant like that of Gilgamesh.
Enkidu was a giant too.
Yes, and he was curiously referred to as a falling star in some translations, which the source sees as a likely veiled reference to his Nephilim identity or origins, Nephilim meaning fallen ones. Enkidu, too, was described as part god, perhaps 1/3 man, 2/3 god, like Gilgamesh.
So maybe Enkidu was one of those post-flood Nephilim from the second violation theory.
That's the speculation offered. He could have been a post-Diluvian Nephilim created by the second violation of creation by other impassioned fallen angels out of spite after the flood.
Okay, what about Utnapishtim himself, the Noah figure?
Here's where it gets really controversial. The source claims Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, was as Nephilim as well, making him an archetypal Nephilim.
The flood hero was a Nephilim.
That's the assertion. He was undoubtedly selected by fallen angels, along with Gilgamesh, for the mission of surviving the flood, specifically, in this cynical view, to continue the Nephilim race and poison post-Diluvian society with their corrupted lineage and knowledge.
Wow. And Zusudra, the Sumerian Noah.
Similarly identified as a Nephilim archetype. While sometimes portrayed as a pious, God-fearing king, other traditions describe him as the son of the god Enki by a female earthling, making him a demigod.
So this completely reframes the Mesopotamian flood story.
It does. What's truly compelling here, the source argues, is how this reinterpretation resolves the apparent contradiction without dismissing either the Bible or the Sumerian texts. This conclusion is presented not as a paradox, but as simple, undeniable reality, because the Epic of Gilgamesh, the counterpart to the biblical Noah, explicitly concedes this conclusion by stating the hero, and by implication, the survivor Utnapishtim, was part god.
So Utnapishtim wasn't just a righteous man like Noah.
No, according to this view, he was no ordinary human. He was considered a titan, like Gilgamesh, Horus, Marduk, 1/3 man and 2/3 god, an ideal military warrior, a titan king, and a demigod. Perhaps even someone who terrorized the antediluvian epoch himself, Selected, therefore, not for righteousness, but to be a master of corruption and violence to poison post-Diluvian society.
That's a dark interpretation. Is there evidence in the king lists?
Yes, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim's Sumerian name, is listed as the 10th and final pre-flood king in the Larsa king list, part of the official record of Sumerian kings. And another Sumerian list explicitly states that these 10 pre-flood kings were literally Nephilim kings that were lowered from heaven.
So the official record's called the pre-flood kings Nephilim.
According to these specific lists and interpretations, yes. This leads the source to conclude that the Mesopotamian narratives aren't the source for the Bible's flood story, but rather parallel legends, recanting and detailing in mythology for future generations the survival story from the deluge concerning the Nephilim.
A parallel Nephilim survival story.
Exactly. The Sumerian lamentation texts further confirm that Nephilim lived with mortal humans in antediluvian times, and that the black-head ones, the ordinary Sumerians, were intermingled antediluvian Sumerians corrupted by the Nephilim, perhaps those day 6 people governed by Cainites we discussed earlier.
And the Book of Enoch mentions Gilgamesh.
Amazingly, yes. The ancient apocryphal Book of Enoch provides startling confirmation. In one section, Maweh, a Nephilim's son of the fallen angel Barakal, has nightmares about the coming deluge. He travels to consult Enoch and learns that the giants' destruction is decreed and they cannot prevent it. Gilgamesh is explicitly named as one of the giants present during these events. His name appears in fragments of the Book of Giants, like manuscript 4Q531, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Gilgamesh in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow, it's a powerful connection. Our source's grand conclusion is this. If Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki Nephilim, was recorded in the biblical source documents like Enoch as one of the giants intimately involved with the knowledge of the coming deluge, then he was likely the one and the same as the Gilgamesh that recanted the Utnapishtim flood narrative much later. He was obviously one of the surviving Nephilim, likely one of the unnamed kin of Utnapishtim mentioned as being saved on the ark.
So Gilgamesh himself survived the flood on Utnapishtim's ark.
That's the bold conclusion. This suggests that biblical records, including apocryphal like Enoch, are the source documents for the Sumerian legends, rather than the other way around. The legends are the Nephilim's version of events.
And this explains the giants encountered later by the Israelites.
Exactly. This interpretation accounts for biblical assertions that giants of the Middle East and of the early post-Diluvian world dwelled in Mesopotamia, Scythia, and the Covenant lands. It also suggests that their diluted royal human bloodlines migrated to Egypt with Ham and Hermes post-Babel. These surviving giants are known in biblical texts as the sons of Anak, who famously inhabited the hill country of Palestine before Israel's entry.
Okay, that's the Mesopotamian version. What of the Greek flood story? Deucalion and Pyrrha? Were they Nephilim too?
Our source strongly suggests yes. Were Greek and other diffused flood legends also recollections of Nephilim's survival, rather than solely human narratives? The argument is compelling. First, consider Noah's wife. In Gnostic texts like the Book of Noria, she's Noria. The Greeks called their flood survivor's wife Pyrrha, and the Greeks called their Noah figure Deucalion.
Deucalion. But was he Nephilim?
The sources argue yes. The Greek hero Deucalion, himself a Nephilim, was forewarned of the coming deluge by his father. Who was his father?
Prometheus.
Prometheus the Titan, who gave fire to humans.
Exactly. Prometheus, a Titan creator god, brother to Zeus in some myths. He provided fire, often seen as an allegory for gnosis or forbidden knowledge, freeing humanity from the restrictions of a higher god like Zeus, or Jehovah in Gnostic parallels.
So if Prometheus was a Titan, a god demigod,
then Deucalion was Prometheus' son, making Deucalion a Titan Nephilim. The source concludes, thus suggesting the Greek account is the Nephilim version in biblical clothing, just as the Gilgamesh version was.
Another Nephilim survival story. And they repopulated the earth with giants. After the flood, the myth says Deucalion and Mother Earth, often interpreted as Pyrrhanoria throwing stones over their shoulders, which became people, allegorically combined to repopulate the earth once more with giants, echoing the original Garianus union, and suggesting a possible second impassioned encounter of dark angels and human females post-flood.
And their descendants.
Deucalion's son Hellenes became the ancestor to all Hellenes Greeks, much like Japheth in the Bible. Hellenes might even be linked to that shadowy Titan ancestor who supposedly led the Greeks against the Atlanteans in another legend.
What about Pyrrhanoria? Was she Nephilim too?
The Gnostic traditions about Noria are fascinating. She has many variant names. She's often portrayed as the intended victim of rape by the evil archons, fallen angels. But critically, the source suggests Noria is a derivative of the infamous Nama of the Cainite and Lamech lineage, who is identified in some Jewish traditions as a known dragon queen of Nephilim bloodlines.
Nama, from Genesis, Tubal-Cain's sister, linked to Nephilim.
Yes. Nama's Greek spelling was Horiah, and she became known as the naughty girl of Jewish legend that openly cavorted with the sons of God. So the implication is clear. Noriapera was a Nephilim, along with Deucalion. She was likely the Nama recorded in Genesis for her infamy and posthumously remembered for surviving the flood in these alternative traditions.
Wow. So both Greek flood survivors were Nephilim. Where did their ark land?
On Mount Parnassus in Greece. Intriguingly, Mount Parnassus sits at roughly the same latitude as Mount Ararat, the traditional landing place of Noah's Ark.
Okay, Greece covered. What about India? Manu.
Indian legends, recorded in the Vedas and Puranas, also articulate a story strikingly similar to the Hebrews, Greeks, and Sumerians. These oral traditions, eventually sent down in Sanskrit, were likely imported or developed by the ancient Aryans.
The Aryans. Their myths connect to others.
Yes, the oldest Vedas are in an archaic Aryan language. Early clans were called Jana, tribe. They spoke related languages like Avestan, Ancient Persian, and Sanskrit. Their pantheon clearly spilled over and influenced Indian and Mediterranean beliefs. Later, Vedic thought developed the concept of Brahman, a universal life force, and the idea of an immortal spark in humans connected to it. The Brahmin priestly clan was established by the 9th century BCE.
And Manu is their flood hero.
Manu is the earliest surviving account of an antediluvian character, a king or leader, in their texts. He's remembered as the father of humankind, but also, significantly, as a member of that recurring surviving brotherhood of the 7 sages. Indian tradition speaks of 6 previous Manus before the flood Manu.
7 sages again. And Manu built an ark.
Yes, he was permitted to allow 7 sages to accompany him on his ark. He was warned of the coming flood by the god Vishnu in his fish avatar, Matsya, and provided with the ark.
So another ark story. Does it mention other civilizations?
It raises an intriguing question from our sources. Did the Satapatha Brahmana, an ancient Indian text detailing the Manu story, implicitly testify to 3 distinct antediluvian worlds? Perhaps Sumer, Atlantis, Mu, and if so, were giants and humans provided arks in all these disparate civilizations? It's speculative, but the possibility of multiple coordinated survivals is raised.
And Manu's role after the flood.
His commission was to reestablish agriculture, using seeds saved on his ark, similar to Noah, who was also an agrarian figure. Manu was uniquely positioned as both an antediluvian king and the post-diluvian patriarchal founder.
Where did his ark land?
On a northern peak of Himavat, the Himalayas, the refugees, including the sages, slowly descended from the mountains.
And his reward?
Like Utnapishtim, he was granted mastery over all knowledge, insights into the mystery of the soul, and a form of immortality.
Was Manu himself Nephilim?
The source concludes he was likely Nephilim. He's often described as a powerful rishi, sage, rather than just a king, the lord of Dravida, ancient southern India.
And the Indian sages, their role?
They were tasked with preserving and repromulgating the antediluvian Vedas knowledge. Having learned from the 7 fallen angels, or their counterparts, they were commissioned to re-civilize the earth, following the same spirit as the Egyptian followers of Horus. They were even given astral manifestations. The 7 stars of the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, are known in India as the Saptarishi, 7 sages, just as Osiris, Isis, and perhaps Quetzalcoatl were associated with Orion, where Azazel was mythically imprisoned.
So consistent patterns everywhere. What about Gnostic traditions? They had survivors too.
Yes. Yet another important Gnostic tradition provides for the survival of the Nephilim, or a related group. This involves an archetypal Seth, crucially distinct from Adam's son Seth, who was saved from the deluge specifically to preserve his immovable and/or incorruptible race.
The Immoveable Race. Who were they?
They're also referred to as the posterity of Seth, the perfect ones, or simply those ones. Gnostic tradition often subdivided history into epochs, with several antediluvian ages. This race was supposedly later transplanted to Sodom and Gomorrah after the flood, but originated from previous ages, antediluvian. Importantly, they were not from Adam's son Seth's lineage.
Where did they come from then?
They were considered the second of 2 races that were created by angels before the deluge. This archetypal Seth, sometimes called Amaka Seth, eternal Seth, founder of the Gnostic race, stem from the posterity of angels and Nephilim.
Created by angels. And how do they survive the flood?
The texts claim that many people from the Immoveable Race guided to a certain place within a luminous cloud to ensure they survived the flood.
Saved in a luminous cloud.
Yes, this luminous cloud seems to be a direct connection to the place, or the angel, which created this mysterious race. One text says this Seth was created in a luminous cloud in the likeness of the angel Adamus, perhaps similar conceptually to how the centaurs were created from a cloud.
And this relates back to Cain.
Some Gnostic views connect this lineage to Cain's posterity, who claimed a more royal and divine legacy, void of Adamite impurity, and pollinated the separate lineage into the Day 6 people.
So this is definitely not the biblical account.
Our source emphasizes that. This literature is not the biblical recollection. It's a parallel Gnostic tradition where the Nephilim, or the Immoveable Race, survived explicitly due to the intercession of fallen angels saving them and their illicit legacy from utter destruction, all done specifically to poison the post-Diluvian world.
Poison the world. How?
Here's the kicker that brings it all together, according to Gnostic thought. After the flood, the descendants of biblical Japheth and Ham, Noah's other sons, went to live among those ones, the Nephilim movable race, and rebelled against God once more at Sodom, thereby intermixing Nephilim bloodlines with the pure Adamite bloodlines of Noah's descendants.
Sodom again, the place of the second corruption.
Precisely. It suggests a continued insidious corruption of humanity's lineage after the deluge, facilitated by these surviving non-human or hybrid races.
Okay, so wrapping this section up, what are the possible ways these different races survived, compatible with Genesis?
Our sources synthesize 4 compatible scenarios that could potentially allow for these survivals alongside Genesis 6, assuming God ordained or allowed them. 1. 2 separate angelic violations, as we discussed. 1 pre-deluge, 1 post-deluge, maybe centered around Sodom. 2. Small bands of Nephilim and/or humans in various antediluvian civilizations, Atlantis, Mu, etc., were warned and protected by fallen angels, who then modeled their survival accounts after Noah's legitimate one. 3. The survival of the immovable race from the ancient Gnostic patriarch Seth, the archetype, protected supernaturally in that luminous cloud. 4. The possibility that God himself provided a Noah equivalent, a righteous survivor and ark, for each of the major 4 antediluvian civilizations or races, not just the Sethite line.
And Nephilim survival specifically.
That likely occurred through other surreptitious schemes offered by dark angels, like sneaking onto Utnapishtim's ark or being saved in the cloud.
So the overall conclusion.
Despite modern orthodoxy's frequent dismissal of these ideas, our source argues that the Bible itself does record several unexplained races surviving the flood, like the Anakim, Rephemic, etc., and furthermore that pagan cultures, other religions, and a variety of secular sources consistently show that their diverse histories and legends are ultimately anchored in the true historic source, Genesis, even if they tell the story from a different, sometimes opposing perspective.
Okay, what an incredible journey we've taken through the ancient world. We've unpacked just countless myths and legends from seemingly every corner of the globe, haven't we? All echoing the shared memory of a cataclysmic flood. But for you, our listener, the most intriguing revelation isn't just the flood itself. It seems to be the persistent, universal accounts of who, or perhaps what, truly survived it.
Absolutely. We've seen how Sumerian kings like Gilgamesh, Greek heroes like Deucalion, Indian patriarchs like Manu, and even that mysterious immovable race from Gnostic texts all point towards the survival of beings beyond Noah's immediate family. And these survivors are often described as giants, demigods, or those possessing unique, sometimes illicit knowledge derived from angels or gods.
Yeah, these narratives suggest a really complex interplay between divine, angelic, and human influence, right?
Yeah.
Culminating in these sophisticated pre-flood civilizations that eventually fell, but whose knowledge and even lineage somehow persisted.
It makes you wonder if these ancient, often competing narratives so consistently describe the survival of certain races or types of beings, along with hidden knowledge and powerful builder gods who shaped early civilization. What does that truly tell us about the foundational history of humanity?
Yeah, what does it tell us?
Well, it raises a provocative thought for you to consider. Could the golden ages remembered across cultures, those eras of sudden technological leaps, megalithic building, and the rule of divine kings, be less about human ingenuity alone and more about a persistent influence? An influence perhaps from the very unnatural order, the Nephilim or their angelic creators, that these ancient texts hint survived the Great Deluge?
A hidden influence continuing after the flood.
And if so, what implications does that have for the hidden currents of history, the secret societies, the preserved knowledge that might continue to shape our world even today?
Wow. Definitely something to ponder long after our deep dive concludes. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of these ancient mysteries. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into your sources.